In July 1518, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped into a narrow cobblestone street in Strasbourg and began to dance. She didn't have a partner, she didn't have music, and she didn't look happy. Her face was a mask of sheer teeth-gritting agony, but her feet wouldn't stop. But as the hours turned into a day, and the day turned into a night, the neighbors realized something was wrong. By the end of the week, 34 people had joined her. By the end of the month, that number hit 400. Think about the physics of that for a second. If you've ever spent an hour on a treadmill, you know the toll of sustained cardio. These people were doing it for days. No sleep, no food, no water. At the height of the crisis, the city was losing 15 people every single day. People were dancing until their ribs snapped and their hearts physically gave out. But the most terrifying part isn't the dance itself. It's what the city did to stop it. They didn't call for a quarantine. They didn't call for a doctor. Instead, they built a stage. This is the story of history's most lethal glitch, and the government-funded stage that turned a medical crisis into a death sentence. To understand how a city glitches like this, you have to look at the baseline stress of the population. For Strasbourg, 1518 was the breaking point. The years leading up to the dance were a relentless sequence of worst-case scenarios. Successive harvest failures had pushed bread prices so high that people were eating grass to survive. Then came the sweat sickness and the arrival of a new, terrifying strain of syphilis that was rotting people from the inside out. In a modern context, we'd call this a collective mental health crisis. But in the 16th century, the only framework for suffering was religious. They lived in a world where every drought and every fever was a direct, personalized punishment from God. They weren't just hungry, they were living in a state of perpetual high-level trauma. And when a population is under that much pressure, the mind starts looking for a release valve. Frau Trophäa didn't just start a dance. She accidentally provided the blueprint for a collective psychological exit. This is where the mystery turns into a massive failure of logistics. The city council, the Ameister, actually acted quite quickly. They consulted the leading medical minds of the era, and the doctors came back with a diagnosis that felt, for the time, incredibly scientific. They rejected the idea of a curse and proposed hot blood. They believed the victims were suffering from an internal fever, and the only way to cool the system was to keep moving. Their official medical advice was to dance it out. What followed was a disastrous experiment in public policy. The council cleared out the grain markets to build massive wooden stages. They commissioned professional musicians, pipers and drummers, to provide a relentless driving beat. They even hired strong men to hold the dancers upright so they wouldn't collapse and stop the healing process. They didn't realize they were building a megaphone for the madness. By providing the stage and the rhythm, the authorities were essentially validating the trance. They turned a private psychological break into a sanctioned public event. They didn't provide a cure. They provided the infrastructure for the plague to spread. For decades, the leading theory for this event was ergotism. The idea is that the city was eating bread made from rye, infected with a fungus that contains alkaloids chemically related to LSD. It's a compelling image, an entire city accidentally tripping on mad bread. But when you look at the clinical data, the theory falls apart. Ergotism restricts blood flow to the limbs. It makes walking incredibly painful and running impossible. The people in Strasbourg weren't stumbling or losing their limbs. they were performing high-intensity aerobic exercise for a month. The more likely culprit is mass psychogenic illness. It's what happens when extreme environmental stress meets a localized belief system. In 1518, that belief was Saint Vitus, a saint who was set to punish the wicked by forcing them to dance. Once the first few people succumbed to the curse, the suggestion spread like a wildfire through a population that was already on the verge of a breakdown. It was a dissociative state, a collective brain hack that allowed them to escape a reality they could no longer endure. The plague didn't end because the people got better. It ended when the council finally realized their hot blood theory was a total failure. So they performed a total 180. They banned the music. They banned the dancing. They loaded the survivors onto wagons and took them to a shrine in the mountains. There, they were given red shoes and led through a ritual to break the curse. And it worked, not because of the shoes, but because the social permission to dance had been revoked. The trance was broken by the same thing that started it, a change in the collective atmosphere. We look back at 1518 and see a primitive tragedy, a city that lost its mind because it didn't have the science to understand its own stress. But there's a much darker possibility here. The dancing plague proves that when the world becomes a nightmare, the human brain doesn't just break, it sinks. It finds a rhythm to escape a reality it can no longer process. And while the wooden stages of Strasbourg are gone, the roots of that behavior are still hardwired into our biology. It makes you wonder, in a world as loud and pressurized as ours today, are we really as far from that stage as we think? Or are we all just waiting for the right beat to start moving? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and share. Subscribe to Roots and Trails for more stories from the past. And let us know in the comments, what do you think caused the dancing plague? Was it the poison bread or the escapist mind? Take care, guys, and see you in the next video.